Chapter 2. The First Cry. The ward flickered the night Cael was born. Not like a flame, not like lightning. It shimmered like breath on glass. There, then gone, leaving the hollow where the village crouched to wonder if they had seen anything at all. Doors opened, faces leaned into the dusk. A pair of boys laughed and dared each other to run and touch the veil. An old woman tugged her shawl tight and muttered a prayer she claimed not to believe in. A farmer snorted, heat, though the air was cold enough to sting. At the edge of the fields, under the crooked tree that had survived more winters than most houses, Old Jarrek tilted his blind eyes toward the wavering light. He lifted 2 fingers and felt the wind brush them, the slightest thread of it, and spoke to no one. The wind remembers him. Inside a narrow house of stone and timber, a child came into the world. There were no songs, no plum wine, no neighbors clustered at the door with bread and salt. Elira gripped the cot's edge, sweat shining along her brow, breath caught between teeth. Darren paced, arms folded, boots clicking and clicking and clicking on the boards as if he could force the hour past by stamping a groove in it. He was not a cruel man by blade, but his words cut often and neatly. "Hurry it along," he muttered to the midwife. "Children come every day. There's nothing special in this one." The midwife did not answer him. She kept her eyes on Elira, on the slow rhythm of pain and breath. Outside, the wind stirred dust across the lane. Somewhere farther off, a dog barked twice and then went quiet, as if remembering something and thinking better of it. When the child cried, the air shifted. It was only a stirring, no more than the turn of a page, but it made the lamp flame bend toward the cradle and gutter, then steady, brighter than before. Frost that clung to the windowsill gathered itself into droplets and ran downward in shy lines. In the corner, a flower Elira had meant to dry and save for spring, brittle for weeks, uncurled a single white petal. The sound of the baby's cry was not loud, yet it seemed to touch every edge of the room and soften it. Elira saw the petal move. She caught her breath, as if the movement had been inside her. Darren did not turn his head. "Drafts," he said, and slammed the shutters. The midwife's mouth opened on a word older than the village. Darren's glance snapped it closed. She crossed herself with a motion so small it was almost a scratch at her own wrist, then bent and wrapped the boy in cloth. "He's healthy," she said, because that was what people said when the truth might be too big. "Strong lungs." "Good," Darren muttered. "He'll need them." Elira took the child and felt the small, steady heat of him. His skin was pale as milk, his eyes startlingly clear, as if the world were not new to him at all, but something he had mislaid and just found again. He did not cry a second time. He laughed, bright and bubbling, as if someone had told him a secret, and the joy of holding it could not be contained. And then the cane tapped. No one had called for Old Jarrek. He came anyway, as he often did on nights when the ward wavered and births came hard. A light on the lane, a voice in the doorway, a whisper that should not know its way to a threshold, but did. He leaned on his crooked staff, white eyes clouded with age, head tilted slightly, as if listening to music most could not hear. The midwife lifted her hands to bar him. "Jarrek." "Let me hold him," Jarrek said, and years fell away in the surety of it. Darren laughed without humor. "You'll not curse my son with your stories, old man." Jarrek did not argue. He only reached out. His hands trembled, yes, but there was a steadiness beneath that shaking, like stone under river water. Elira hesitated, only that, and then passed the child to him. The baby stilled the way small creatures sometimes do when they hear a thing belonging to them alone. In the pause, the lamp gave a clean breath. Even Daran's muttering faltered. Jarrek's face softened. His cracked lips shaped a smile, as frail and stubborn as new grass pushing through ice. "The wind remembers him," he said. Elira frowned, as if the words hurt a place already sore. "He's just a child." "A child and nothing more," Daran barked. He took Cael back too roughly and laid him at Elira's side. "You'll not fill his head with madness. You'll not fill my house with it." "Madness?" Jarrek murmured. He tapped his staff once. "Remember my madness well, for it has begun again." He left. The cane's rhythm thinned into the lane, then into the hush of the night, until it was lost under the small sounds of a house learning the measure of a new breath. They named him Cael. No middle name, no blessing, just a name, spoken without joy, because joy was a currency they could not afford to spend on rumor. That night, the frost melted early along the back step, and a thumbprint of green showed in the grass beneath the window. Elira saw it in the grey before dawn. She said nothing. She bent and rubbed it away with the heel of her hand, until it was only wet earth again. The village spoke, as villages do, over bread, at wells, while mending nets and stripping husks. Not of the child. The child was a private matter and therefore safe to pry at, but of the ward, which was public and therefore everyone's business. The veil had shimmered. Warnings and scoffs were traded in equal measure. A boy's uncle swore he'd seen a thin shape leaning on the ward like a tired traveller at a fence. His sister called him a fool, then lit an extra lamp at her door that evening without saying why. The elders argued in low voices whether the old songs were warnings or lullabies. The younger ones laughed. They always laughed until they didn't. Old Jarrek did not add his voice. He walked the edge of the fields with his staff, brushing the tips of dead grasses with his fingers as if reading a book whose pages had been left out in the rain. When he came to the crooked tree, he sat beneath it and turned his blind eyes toward a horizon not marked by lines of hill or hedge. At dawn, he rose and carved a small token from bone, a spiral etched by patient hands, the sign of breath. He left it on Daran's step and went away without knocking. Elira found it hours later while sweeping. She looked up and down the lane as if someone might be watching, then tucked the bone into the hem of the rush mat by the bed. She did not ask herself why she hid it. If she had, she might have said it was to keep the house free of nonsense. She might have said it was to keep Daran from anger. The truth was a quieter thing, too small and steady to name. Cael laughed often. He laughed like water at the lip of a spring. Not loud, not showy, but with a clarity that made you swallow before you knew you were thirsty. His eyes were bright. His hands reached for the sky or for nothing at all, which with babies is the same thing. When he giggled, the curtains stirred, though the shutters were tight. When he slept, the air pressed itself flat and still, as if the house had put its finger to its lips and said, "Hush." "Coincidence," Daran said, each time Elira's gaze snagged on the curl of a petal or the clean line of melt along a sill. The world makes fools of frightened people. He grew shorter with the neighbors who came to borrow tools, and longer with the bottle he filled only on winter feast days before. Work went poorly. The soil had soured early, and what little he coaxed up browned at the edges like letters burned unread. Men at the market began to aim their jokes close to his ear, hoping for a flinch that would pass for laughter. Darren met Jokes with a flat stare, and Jokes turned to quiet, and quiet turned to the kind of silence that sticks like burrs to a man's coat and follows him home. Elira measured her days in small mercies. A nap that lasted until she'd finished mending a sleeve. A neighbor's girl who brought cheese and stayed to sweep without asking. The bloom that opened by the hearth one morning, where no bloom had any right to be. She burned that last before Darren came in for his dinner. It smoked sweetly, like something remembered, and she told herself the sting in her eyes was from the smoke. Word of Cael travelled as words do, on feet that make detours for the pleasures of detouring. Some said blessing, more said curse. A boy born the night the ward shakes, a woman whispered at the well, exactly loud enough. Blessing, curse? What's the difference when the end is the same? Her friend shushed her and told her to mind her bucket. The midwife did not speak of what she had seen. She pressed the corner of an old prayer cloth against her lips when she passed Elira's lane, and then told herself she was only wiping dust. Jarrek watched. Often he sat just beyond the cottage in a spot that would not block the path, where shadows from the fence slats climbed his legs like vines. He listened to the boys' laughter and nodded to himself, as if counting beats in a song that others thought only wind. When children shouted, "Mad Jarrek," and tossed pebbles that missed him by feet they swore were inches, he smiled in a way that made them uncomfortable and sent them running, their courage falling from their ankles like nettles. He did not go into the house again. He did not need to. The wind was talkative where others were not. It told him of lamps that leaned when Cael coughed, of small runnels of warmth finding their way under door and along floor, of Elira's hands that always tried to be kind, first, even when fear tugged them toward denial. The wind knows the shape of a room from the inside out. Jarrek had learned to listen because once, long ago, he had learned to be very quiet indeed. Winter came knuckled and grey, on a morning when the ward was a pale curtain, half seen, unless you stared. Elira found blossoms pushing up between the boards where Cael had crawled, pale, not from light, but from the lack of it. They turned their faces to him, as if there were a sun inside his chest. She cupped them in her palm, soft as breathing, and then fed them to the fire one by one, telling herself she was only sweeping, only tidying, only making a house fit for a family that did not believe in stories. "I saw you," her neighbor whispered at the well later, more curious than cruel. "What did you burn?" "Elira's supper," Daran said, appearing before the answer could be born. "Not that it matters. You're feeding too much of yourselves to gossip, and look what it's done to your bones." He smiled, thin as wire. The women lowered their eyes. Elira filled her bucket and carried it home. The year rolled forward on a wheel of small days. Cael grew quickly. He learned the shape of his mother's shoulder and the edge of his father's voice. He laughed in all the wrong places and some of the right ones, as if he knew the world could be coaxed a fraction softer if only reminded. He reached for dust motes and found them, and held them open-palmed, as if they were butterflies and not bits of old wall. He slept with his mouth barely open, and the hush in the room was such that even spiders paused in their work, as if to listen. Darren forbade Elira from speaking of anything unusual the child did. "There's nothing to speak of," she said, which was true in the way a river is nothing but water. "Good," Darren said. "Keep it that way." At market, a man from the far side of the hollow said too easily, "I heard your ward sang last night." Another laughed. A third shook his head. Daran bought grain and paid with coin that looked larger in his hand than in his purse. He carried the sack home on his shoulder and did not stop when Jarrek lifted his cane a fraction in greeting. That evening, Jarrek sat in his hut and held his hands over a candle's thin flame until the ache of heat was clean. He shut his white eyes and saw not darkness, but a map of memories after images. The first ward he had ever stood beneath, bright as birds in a storm. A woman who had worn the night down her back like a cloak, the way the world had held its breath and then exhaled a century's safety. He saw his mother's hands. He could not remember their faces. He heard his own breath in that hut, and in it a note that did not belong to him. "The wind remembers him," Jarrek whispered, and the candle bent toward his mouth as if it agreed. On a thaw wet afternoon before spring had the decency to declare itself, Elira swept the floor and found the bone token again where the mat had frayed, the spiral etched to the quick. She meant to throw it out. Her hand did not. She slipped it into the seam of her sleeve and said aloud to the empty room, "It's only a bit of bone." Cael laughed from the cradle. The sound was small and bright and completely unafraid. Outside, beneath the crooked tree, Jarrek lifted his face to the passing of a barely there breeze and smiled with a tenderness that would have surprised anyone who thought they knew him. He turned his ear toward the thin, shining veil at the far edge of the fields, and though it did not speak, he listened as if it might. When dusk, that careful liar, reached its fingers into the lanes and under the doors, lamps bloomed across the village like cautious flowers. Cael slept. Elira watched his chest rise and fall and told herself she was watching for fever. Daran checked the latch twice and the shutters 3 times and told himself he was watching for thieves. Somewhere, a dog barked twice and then fell silent, as if remembering that silence was safer. Children whispered stories on pallets and their mothers hissed them quiet, calling stories childish, as if adults did not tell worse. The ward flickered. Some called it a trick of heat. Some touched their throats and named nothing. Old Jarrek did not laugh. He tapped his staff once against the frozen ground to feel how it answered him. Then, to no one and to the wind that is always everyone's and no one's, he said it again. Not a prophecy, not yet, only a truth put into shape. The wind remembers him. Cael has only just begun. Episode 3 coming soon.